The rain came down in sheets that evening, turning the broad glass face of the Lawson Dynamics building into a blur of smeared light and shadow. Daniel Harper stepped through the revolving door with his worn canvas tool bag slung over one shoulder, water dripping from the brim of his baseball cap and pooling on the polished lobby floor. He paused just inside, letting the warmth of the building settle around him, and looked up at the towering atrium ceiling with the kind of quiet, unhurried gaze that belonged to a man who had long since stopped being impressed by grand spaces. The receptionist glanced at him with mild curiosity, then at her screen, then back at him, as if trying to reconcile the man in front of her with the name on her visitor log. He gave her a small nod and told her his name. She handed him a badge without much ceremony. He clipped it to his jacket and took the elevator to the 14th floor. Earlier that afternoon, Daniel had been standing in the parking lot of Maplewood Elementary with a cup of lukewarm coffee, watching the doors for Emma. It had been raining since noon, and the other parents were clustered under the narrow overhang near the entrance, some of them scrolling through their phones without looking up, others talking with the practiced distraction of people who had been doing this long enough that the waiting no longer required their full attention. Daniel stood apart from them, in the open, the rain soaking the shoulders of his jacket. He didn't mind it. He liked this part of the day. The particular quality of the anticipation. The way the next few minutes always felt like the most reliable thing on the schedule. Emma came out in her yellow rain jacket, backpack bouncing, and spotted him immediately across the parking lot. She ran across the wet pavement without any hesitation, as if the distance between them was simply an inconvenience to be eliminated as quickly as possible. And he caught her the way he always did, one arm sweeping her up, the bag swinging, her laughter bright and sudden in the gray afternoon. She was 7 years old and she still wanted to be carried, at least in the rain, and he was glad for it. He knew the years when she'd want that were already numbered. They drove home in his old truck, the heater working just well enough to matter. And Emma told him about her day in the scattered, overlapping way she had something about a caterpillar in the science corner, something about a boy named Marcus who had broken a crayon and cried about it. Something about the book her teacher had started reading after lunch. Daniel listened to all of it, asking questions at the right moments, turning down the radio so he could hear better. Their apartment was a 2-bedroom unit on the 3rd floor of a building on Elm Street that had seen better decades but was clean and warm and familiar. He made pasta while she sat at the kitchen table doing homework, and they ate together watching the rain streak the windows. His phone rang at 6:47. The number was local, but not one he recognized. He almost let it go to voicemail, then answered out of habit. The voice on the other end was clipped and professional, a man named Marcus Webb from Lawson Dynamics, the largest technology firm in the city. He explained the situation quickly. The CEO's primary laptop had failed. The device contained critical files needed for a merger agreement worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Documents that had to be reviewed and signed within 48 hours. Their internal IT team had spent 3 days on it. They had brought in 2 outside specialists. None of them had been able to get the machine to boot, and the data recovery software they had run had returned nothing useful. Someone had given Webb Daniel's name. He wasn't sure why someone had thought a freelance technician was the answer when corporate specialists had failed. But at this point, Webb said, they were willing to try anything. Daniel listened. He asked 3 questions about the nature of the failure, the specific error codes that had appeared before the crash, whether the machine had been opened by anyone during the attempted repairs, and whether the drive had ever been exposed to a strong magnetic field or water. Webb put him on hold twice to find the answers. When he came back with them, Daniel was quiet for a moment, running the information through the part of his mind that had spent 15 years thinking about exactly these kinds of problems. He told Webb he could come in that evening. When he hung up, Emma was watching him from across the table. She had that expression she got sometimes serious, measuring, older than 7, and she asked if it was a job. He said it was a big one, and explained that he'd need to call Mrs. Patterson next door to see if Emma could stay there for a few hours. Emma thought about this for a moment, then said he should definitely go. She said it with the kind of quiet certainty that used to remind him of her mother, And still did, and he had to look down at the table for just a second before he could respond. He packed his bag carefully, while Emma got her things together for Mrs. Patterson's. He had every tool he owned in that bag: diagnostic cables, a set of precision screwdrivers in graduated sizes, a portable data recovery unit he had rebuilt himself from components, a bootable USB drive loaded with specialized software he had written and refined over the course of many years. He'd carried the bag to apartment offices, to small businesses, to people's kitchen tables. He had never carried it somewhere quite like this. He kissed Emma on the top of her head at Mrs. Patterson's door, told her he'd be back before 10, and drove through the rain to the other side of the city. Victoria Lawson was 30 years old, and she had been the youngest CEO in the company's 30-year history for exactly 2 years and 4 months. She was good at the job, not just competent, but genuinely gifted in the way that some people are gifted at reading rooms and understanding systems and making decisions under conditions where most people simply froze. She had grown up in this company. Literally and figuratively, her father, Robert Lawson, had built it from a 3-person startup in a rented office downtown, and Victoria had spent her summers and school breaks inside it, watching him work, listening to him think out loud, absorbing by proximity the particular discipline of a man who treated every decision like it mattered, because he believed, fundamentally, that it did. Robert had died of a sudden cardiac event 2.5 years ago. Victoria had taken over the company within the month. The merger agreement currently sitting in the pipeline represented the largest transaction in the company's history, a deal that would expand Lawson Dynamics into 3 new international markets and position the company for a decade of growth that Robert had always believed was possible but had never quite had the time or resources to pursue. Victoria had spent 14 months building toward this moment. The documents were prepared, the terms were agreed upon in principle, and the signing was scheduled for Friday afternoon. The laptop had failed on Tuesday morning. She had been in a meeting when it happened, had come back to her office to find her screen dark and unresponsive, the machine giving no indication of what had caused the failure or how serious it was. Her assistant had called IT within minutes, and by the time Victoria had gotten through the rest of the afternoon's obligations and returned to her office, 2 technicians were already working on it, their own machines spread around the conference table, expressions of careful concentration on their faces that she recognized as the professional version of worry. The internal team had worked on it for the rest of that day and into the night, and they had called in a consultant on Wednesday morning, a specialist who came with credentials and a confident manner that lasted about 4 hours before giving way to a quieter, more uncertain posture. By Wednesday evening, when that second specialist had also failed to recover anything and had begun suggesting that the data might simply be unrecoverable, Victoria had stopped sleeping properly. She sat in her office on Wednesday night, in the kind of stillness that comes not from calm but from controlled panic, going through the mental inventory of what she had lost. The merger documents existed in backup form, fragmented across emails and earlier drafts, but the final consolidated version, the one with all the annotations, the specific language that had taken months of difficult back and forth to settle, existed only on that laptop. She had been meticulous about security. The device was encrypted, strictly offline for the most sensitive work. That same security was now working against her. When Marcus Webb told her on Thursday afternoon that he had reached out to a freelance technician, she looked at him for a long moment and asked whether he was serious. He told her about the brief conversation, the specific questions, the way the man had listened. She nodded once and told him to bring the technician in. She was watching through the glass panel beside her office door when Daniel arrived on the floor. He was not what she had pictured. He was perhaps 35, lean, with the kind of face that was easy to overlook in a crowd, not because there was anything wrong with it, but because it offered nothing to latch onto, no performance of confidence or expertise, nothing that announced itself. He shook hands with Webb, listened to the briefing, and looked at the laptop on the conference table with the same expression she imagined a doctor might have looking at an X-ray. Then he asked, politely but without hesitation, if he could work alone. He said the presence of other people in the room tended to create pressure that wasn't useful for the kind of focused, systematic work he needed to do. Victoria, watching from outside, almost said no. Then she said yes. She told her assistant to give him whatever he needed, and she went back to her office and tried to read through a document she had already read 4 times. The conference room had a long glass wall that faced the main office floor, and several of the engineers found reasons to walk slowly past it over the course of the evening. What they saw was not especially dramatic. Daniel sat at the far end of the table, with the laptop open in front of him, and a series of tools arranged on a cloth to his left. He worked with his hands in a way that was precise, without being theatrical, making each movement count. He had attached a diagnostic device to the laptop's port, and was watching the readout on his own small screen, and occasionally he would make a note on a pad of paper. He did not look hurried. He did not look uncertain. He did not look up. What Daniel was seeing, in those first 40 minutes, was a picture that made a certain kind of cold sense. The machine had experienced a firmware-level corruption, not a simple crash, but a cascading failure that had locked the system out of its own boot process. The previous technicians had correctly identified this as the problem. Where they had gone wrong was in their approach to fixing it. 2 of the attempts had involved writing new boot sector data over the corrupted sections, which was a reasonable first approach but had, in this case, compounded the problem because the drive had a secondary issue, a mechanical weakness in one of the read heads that had been causing intermittent, nearly invisible errors for months before the final failure. Every time someone had tried to force the drive to read during a recovery attempt, they had pushed the weakened head a little further toward the edge of its operating tolerance. Daniel recognized this pattern because he had seen it before, years ago, in a context very different from a corporate conference room. He understood immediately that the key was not to push harder but to stop pushing entirely, to create the most stable possible environment for the drive, and let the recovery process move at the drive's own pace, rather than demanding that the drive move at the recovery software's pace. He powered the machine down completely. He removed the drive. He connected it to his portable unit using a cable that would draw minimal power. Set his software to its most conservative recovery mode, the one that moved slowly, almost painfully slowly, but put the least possible stress on a damaged component and let it begin. Then he waited. The waiting was the part that looked the most like doing nothing. He sat in the quiet conference room, with the rain still loud against the glass, and a cup of coffee that someone had brought him growing cold at his elbow, and he watched the progress bar move in increments, so small, they were almost invisible. He checked his phone. Emma had texted him a picture of the drawing she'd made at Mrs. Patterson's house, with a large sun above it, which seemed optimistic given the weather, and 2 stick figures of unequal height that he recognized as the 2 of them. He looked at it for a moment before turning the phone face down on the table. He thought, the way he often did in quiet moments, about the nature of what he did. He had spent years inside large organizations, surrounded by people who ran on urgency and competition and the constant performance of being indispensable. He had been good at that life, good enough to be valued and promoted and positioned for more. Then he had watched his wife, Rebecca, get sick and fight, and eventually stop fighting, and the entire architecture of what he had thought his life was supposed to be had simply stopped making sense. He had walked away not out of grief exactly, or not only out of grief, but because he had realized, sitting in a hospital room for the last weeks of Rebecca's life, that the things he had spent the most time on were not the things that mattered most to him, and that the time left to correct that imbalance was shorter and less predictable than he had ever let himself believe. Emma had been 3 years old when Rebecca died. She barely remembered her mother. There were flashes, Daniel believed, impressions more than memories. The particular sound of a laugh, a color associated with warmth, something about the smell of a certain lotion, but nothing that assembled itself into a coherent picture of a person. That was a sorrow that lived in Daniel in a place too deep for daily life to reach. A grief that was also a grief on Emma's behalf, a preemptive mourning of the relationship Emma would never get to build. But it was accompanied by something else, a fierceness, a clarity, a determination that the one thing he had left to do as well as he possibly could was be her father. Not in the way he had been heading toward before, the distracted, well-intentioned but largely absent kind of father that his previous career trajectory had been quietly designing him for, but actually present, actually there, in the small and ordinary moments that turned out to be the ones that mattered. He had rebuilt his work life around that priority, instead of the other way around, taking the freelance jobs that let him be home when Emma got home from school, that let him be at her school plays and her soccer games and her Saturday morning pancakes. He made less money. He drove an older truck. He wore the same jacket he'd had for 6 years. None of that felt like sacrifice. It felt like sense. At 2 hours and 17 minutes into the recovery process, the software flagged a completed sector scan. Daniel looked at the readout and felt the particular quiet satisfaction that came from being right about the approach. The data was there. The vast majority of it was intact. He began the extraction process, this time using a partition-level copy protocol that would pull everything at once without requiring the drive's read head to seek back and forth across the disk. He watched the file tree populate on his screen, category by category, folder by folder. Business files, system files, encrypted archives, document folders, the entire working landscape of a person who ran a large company and kept everything in one place. And then, nested inside a folder labeled simply with the year from a decade and a half ago, a subdirectory appeared. It was labeled with initials and a date, the kind of informal, personal naming convention people used for things they organized for themselves rather than for anyone else. Daniel's eyes moved across it for just a moment, long enough to register the thumbnail images that appeared in the preview pane before he had clicked anything small rectangles that resolved, at the corner of his vision, into what were unmistakably photographs. He saw enough in that fraction of a second to know what kind of photographs they were. He moved his cursor away from that folder. He did not open it. He did not look at the thumbnails more carefully. He did not allow himself the rationalization that would have been easy and available, that he hadn't meant to see it. That he was only checking what had been recovered. That nobody would know. He knew what he had seen and he knew what it was. Something private. Something that belonged to the person who had put it there. Something that had absolutely nothing to do with him. He flagged the folder in his recovery log as personal, non-business, do not review, and continued with the extraction. He worked for another hour, verifying the integrity of every file in the business partitions, running checksum comparisons to confirm that the copied data matched the original, making careful notes in his log about which files were complete and which had sustained any minor corruption. When he was finished, he had recovered 98.7% of the drive's content, and the remaining 1.3% consisted of temporary cache files and system logs that were regenerated automatically and had no bearing on anything important. He packed his tools with the same deliberate care with which he had unpacked them. He looked at his notes one more time. Then he went to find Marcus Webb and told him that the CEO should probably come take a look. Victoria was in her office, still at her desk, when her assistant knocked and told her the technician was ready. She walked down the hall to the conference room, with the carefully managed pace of a person who had trained herself not to show nervousness, and she stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the laptop, now closed, sitting on the conference table with a small blue indicator light, blinking steadily. Daniel was standing near the window, his bag already on his shoulder, his notes folded in his breast pocket. He met her eyes and gave a small nod, the kind that conveyed something without words. She sat down and opened the laptop. It came to life immediately, the login screen appearing after a 3-second boot sequence that was faster than it had been even before the crash, because Daniel had, in the course of the recovery work, cleared a significant amount of corrupted system data that had been slowing the machine down without announcing itself. She typed her password, and the desktop appeared, clean and organized and entirely familiar. Every folder in its place. Every shortcut where she had left it. For a moment, she simply sat and breathed. Then the implications of what she was looking at began to register on the people standing around the room. Someone, one of the senior engineers who had come in after hours to wait for the outcome, said something under their breath that might have been a word or might have been a sound, and then the room quietly came apart at the seams. 2 people started talking at once. Someone else pulled out their phone. Webb shook someone's hand. The relief in the room had that particular quality that comes from tension too long sustained. It didn't land all at once, but seemed to seep in, warming people from the edges and then suddenly everyone was talking, and the noise level climbed, and the windows were still dark with rain, and the clock on the wall said it was nearly 10. Victoria opened the merger folder and scrolled through the documents, not reading them, but verifying their presence, their dates, their file names. All of it was there. Everything she needed was there. She sat for a moment with her hands flat and her eyes closed, and in the privacy of that moment, behind her eyelids, she allowed herself something she very rarely permitted: the simple, uncomplicated relief of a problem being solved. When she opened her eyes, she saw the folder. It was in the bottom left quadrant of her desktop, exactly where it had always been, a small yellow icon with the initials and the date she remembered putting there 11 years ago, the year after her father died, the year she had gathered every digital photograph and scanned letter and video file she had of him, and put them all in one place, because she needed them to be in one place, needed to know they were there, needed the specific comfort of knowing she could reach them. She had forgotten, over the years of other laptops and transferred files and system migrations, that the folder had made it to this machine. She had forgotten until 2 years ago, when the laptop had crashed, the first time a smaller crash, recovered easily, and she had gone looking for the folder afterward and found it gone, and had spent a night telling herself it was fine, that she still had memories, that the photographs weren't the person, and then had spent most of the following week not entirely believing any of that. She had believed, for 2 years, that the folder was gone. She put her hand on the trackpad and double-clicked the icon. The folder opened. The photographs were there. Every one of them. Her father's face looked back at her from 100 small rectangles, young, older, still. Him at a conference table in the early days of the company. Him in a backyard somewhere with a spatula and an expression of theatrical concentration. Him sitting in a hospital chair holding a very small Victoria in a yellow dress on what must have been her 2nd or 3rd birthday, both of them laughing at something the camera couldn't see. There was a video file birthday, it said, and a year, and she knew without opening it that she knew exactly what was in it, could almost hear her father's voice before she clicked play. There was a scanned document, 2 pages, in handwriting she would have known anywhere. Victoria sat very still. The noise in the room had not stopped, but it had moved to a different register, and no one was looking at her directly, which was fortunate, because her eyes had filled and she was not quite ready to be seen. She sat with her hands in her lap and her father's face on the screen in front of her, and the weight of 2 years of thinking something was gone pressing against the relief of finding out it wasn't. She was aware, distantly, that her face was doing something she didn't usually let it do in professional settings. She was aware that she didn't particularly care. After a moment, she looked up at Daniel. He was still standing near the window, watching the room rather than her, with the patient, unobtrusive quality of a person who understood that the moment didn't belong to him. She looked at his face and thought about the folder, about the fact that it had been on the drive, accessible during the recovery process, visible to anyone working with the file system. She thought about the hours he had been alone in this room. "Did you look at them?" she asked. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "Did you open that folder?" He held her gaze. "No," he said. "I saw enough to know it was personal. I closed it immediately and marked it in my log as not to be reviewed." He paused. "It wasn't mine to look at." She held his gaze for a long moment. There was a quality to his stillness that she found, in that moment, more impressive than anything else she had encountered that evening, more impressive than the technical recovery, more impressive than the speed, or the competence, or the results. She had spent 2 years in a position where she was surrounded by people who wanted things from her attention, her approval, her resources, her trust. She had learned to read the particular way a person held themselves when they wanted something. Daniel Harper was not holding himself that way. He was simply standing there, having done what he had come to do, waiting to be dismissed so he could go home. "Thank you," she said. It came out with more weight than the words usually carried. He nodded, picked up his bag, and told her he'd send the invoice in the morning. The next morning, while Emma was eating cereal at the kitchen table and the rain had finally stopped, and the light through the window was the particular clean gold of a washed morning, Daniel sat at his own small desk in the corner of the living room and wrote up his work log. He itemized the tools used, the techniques applied, the results achieved. He noted the condition of the drive and his recommendation that it be replaced before being put back into regular use. He added his hourly rate and the time worked and sent the invoice to the address Webb had given him. 2 hours later, his phone rang. It was Victoria Lawson. She explained, made some inquiries. She named 3 companies' names that Daniel recognized, significant names in the technology industry, and said that she understood he had held positions at all 3. She said the words senior software architect and technical director with the careful, precise diction of someone who wanted to make clear that she understood what those titles meant. She asked why he was doing freelance laptop repair. He told her about Emma, about Rebecca, about the decision he had made. He did not tell it as a dramatic story or a tragedy or anything that required her sympathy. He told it the way he thought about it himself, as a choice, clearly made, that he didn't regret. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Then she said she'd like to take him to dinner. He said he didn't think that was necessary. She said she wasn't asking because it was necessary. They met at a restaurant near the waterfront on Saturday evening, after he had dropped Emma at his sister Carol's house for the night. It was a quiet place, not the kind that announced itself with a line out the door or a famous name, but the kind that had been in the same spot for 20 years because the food was honest and the tables weren't crowded together, and they sat at a corner table with the city lights blurred and soft through the rain-washed window beside them. They talked for 3 hours. Victoria told him about growing up inside her father's company, about the particular loneliness of being the person everyone looked to for decisions in the months after he died, about learning to carry the weight of other people's uncertainty at a time when she had plenty of her own. She talked about her father's handwriting, the way his notes in the margins of documents had been almost illegible to everyone else, but perfectly clear to her after years of reading them, and how she still caught herself reaching for his judgment on hard decisions before remembering that she was the judgment now. Daniel listened the way he always listened, fully, without the restlessness that some people showed when they were waiting for their turn to speak. He told her about Emma's drawing, the one with the house and the sun and the 2 stick figures. He described the particular look Emma got when she was thinking hard about something, the way she chewed her bottom lip the same way Rebecca always had. Victoria laughed at the right moments, was quiet at the right moments, and asked questions that were the right questions. Before the end of the evening, she made him an offer. Chief Technology Officer, Lawson Dynamics, a salary number that he didn't visibly react to, though it was more than he had made at any point in his corporate career. Full benefits, equity, access to resources he had not had in years. He said no without hesitating. She looked at him across the table with an expression that was more curious than offended. She asked why. He explained that the thing he had built, the life he had rebuilt, was working. Emma's school was 2 miles from their apartment. He knew her teacher's name and her best friend's name and the name of the boy named Marcus, who had broken a crayon and cried about it. He was there when she got home from school. He was there on Saturday mornings for pancakes. He was there. The jobs he took were enough to live on, and living on enough was something he had chosen deliberately, and he wasn't willing to exchange it for a title, even a significant one. Victoria didn't argue. She sat with his answer for a moment, and then said she understood, and he believed that she did. She called him again on Monday. She had thought, she said, about what he had told her, and she wanted to ask whether there was a version of the arrangement that could work something with real flexibility, a consultant structure rather than an executive structure, project-based engagement with schedule control in his hands. She was not asking him to change his priorities. She was asking if there was a way to bring his skills into the company that fit around the life he had built rather than replacing it. He thought about it for 2 days. He talked to Emma about it, in the simplified version that made sense to a 7-year-old, that there was a woman named Victoria who ran a big company and had asked him to help her sometimes. Emma asked if Victoria was nice. He said he thought she was. Emma said he should help her then, because helping people was the right thing to do, and she said it with the exact tone and cadence of something he had said to Emma herself on many occasions, and he sat there for a moment feeling the particular bittersweet comedy of a lesson coming back to you from the mouth of your own child. He called Victoria and said yes. The first project he worked on was a security architecture review that had been stalled for 6 months. He completed it in 3 weeks, working mornings after Emma left for school and evenings after she went to bed, with occasional full days when Emma was at Carol's. The work was good, not just competent, but the kind of thorough, imaginative problem-solving that reflected years of experience processed through a mind that had stayed sharp, even while spending the better part of 4 years doing work that didn't challenge it. The team that received his recommendations didn't know quite what to make of them at first. They were accustomed to reports that recommended the most expensive solution and the one that required the most ongoing involvement from outside consultants. Daniel's report recommended the most elegant solution, which was also significantly cheaper, and included detailed implementation notes that meant the internal team could execute it themselves. Victoria read the report on a Friday afternoon and called him that evening to tell him it was excellent. He thanked her and told her Emma had lost a tooth that day, which she had discovered was the kind of information Victoria actually wanted to hear rather than merely politely received. A few weeks after the security project wrapped, Victoria came to a minor company gathering that happened to fall on a Saturday and that Daniel attended with Emma in tow. Carol having had a prior commitment, Emma was wearing her good green dress and a pair of sneakers she had insisted on despite the dress, and she shook Victoria's hand with a gravity that was almost entirely undermined by the gap in her front teeth. Victoria crouched down to Emma's level without being asked to, which Daniel noted, and they had a conversation that lasted approximately 8 minutes and covered the topics of crayons, caterpillars, and the general trustworthiness of weather forecasts. Emma decided, on the spot and completely visibly, that Victoria was all right. Daniel watched this from across the room and felt something he couldn't quite name, not quite relief, not quite happiness, but something in the space between them. Over the months that followed, he became a fixed and valued presence at Lawson Dynamics without ever occupying a fixed and titled role. He solved problems when they arose. He mentored junior engineers in the kind of informal, conversation-based way that turned out to produce better results than formal training programs. He sat in on product planning meetings and said very little until he had something genuinely useful to say, and then said it clearly and without concern for whether it was what people wanted to hear. He did not angle for credit. When a project succeeded, he pointed to the team members who had executed the work. When a project ran into trouble, he showed up first and left last, and never once expressed the particular variety of stress that makes a difficult situation worse for everyone around it. Victoria observed all of this. She had been running a company for more than 2 years, and she had learned to watch people carefully, had learned to distinguish between the performance of competence and the real thing, between the performance of character and the real thing. She had seen many intelligent people in that time. She had seen far fewer people who were both genuinely gifted and genuinely good. Not occasionally good, not strategically good, but constitutionally good, the kind of good that operated the same way whether or not anyone was watching. She thought about the folder. She thought about the hours he had spent alone in the conference room, with access to the most personal and professional data she had, and the only thing he had done with that access was protect it. She thought about that more than she expected to. The annual company gathering was held in late spring, in the large conference hall on the top floor of the building, with the whole city spread out beyond the glass in the long evening light. The entire staff was there: engineers, designers, operations teams, finance people, executives, along with a handful of clients and partners. Daniel was at a table near the center of the room with a couple of the junior engineers he had been working with. And Emma was beside him in the green dress again, now with matching shoes, because Carol had taken her shopping. Eating from a small plate of appetizers with the focused contentment of a child at a grown-up party who has been promised she can stay up late. Victoria stood up to speak partway through the evening, after the formal business of the gathering had been concluded. She was good at speaking, not in the rehearsed, performed way of people who have been trained to speak, but in the direct, grounded way of someone who knew what she wanted to say and trusted herself to say it. She talked about the year, about the growth, and the challenges, and the team that had made both possible. She talked about the merger that had closed successfully, about the new markets that were beginning to take shape, and then she stopped and said she wanted to tell a story. She told it simply, without embellishment: the crash, the failed attempts, the technician who had arrived in the rain with an old bag, and a willingness to be patient where everyone else had been urgent. She described the recovery. She described sitting down at the laptop and finding everything there. She described the folder and what was in it, and what it had meant to her to find it again after 2 years of believing it was gone. She said, "I asked him whether he had looked at any of it. He told me he had seen enough to know it was personal, and he had immediately closed it, because it was not his to look at." The room was quiet. "I have worked with a great many talented people," Victoria said. "Talent is not rare, not at the level we're working at. You don't get to this room without talent. What is rare, what is genuinely, meaningfully rare, is someone who is skilled and also completely trustworthy. Not trustworthy because they think they're being watched. Not trustworthy because it's in their contract. But trustworthy because that's how they are." She paused. "That is what Daniel Harper is, and I think this company is better for having him in it. And I am certain that I am better for knowing him. And I wanted to say that in front of all of you because I think those things deserve to be said out loud." She looked at him across the room and lifted her glass. The room followed. People stood. Not the polite, obligatory kind of standing that happens at formal occasions, the kind where people look sideways to see if others are standing before deciding to stand themselves, the spontaneous kind, the kind that starts in one corner because a person there simply cannot stay seated, and then moves outward table by table because something in the moment simply demands it. Daniel sat for a second, slightly behind the moment, not because he was slow to understand what was happening, but because he genuinely hadn't expected it and wasn't sure how to receive it. Then he stood because there was nothing else to do, and the room applauded. And it was not the noise of a crowd performing approval, but something warmer and more genuine than that. The sound of people who worked alongside someone every day and had been accumulating, without naming it, a particular kind of regard for him. A regard that had just been given a name and a reason to be expressed. Emma, beside him, was looking up at her father. She was not entirely sure what was happening, but she was sure it was good. Sure of it the way children are sure of things they understand, through feeling, before they can understand them through thinking. She saw the way the people in the room were looking at him. She saw the way he stood straight, a little surprised, with the particular dignity of a person being seen clearly and not sure what to do with it. She slipped her hand into his and held on. He looked down at her. She was grinning, the gap in her front teeth very visible, her eyes bright with the reflected lights of the evening, and something additional, something interior. He thought, not for the first time, and not for the last, that Rebecca would have loved to see this. That thought always carried its own weight, its own quiet ache. But tonight it also carried something else, a sense that the life they had built together had not ended when Rebecca died, had instead continued in a different shape, with a different gravity, and that the shape it had taken was not one he would trade. He looked back at the room, at the people still standing, at Victoria across the crowd, who had given him something that evening that was more than a speech had given him. In some way he would take time to fully understand. A kind of restoration, not of his career, exactly, or not only that, but of the particular knowledge that the things he had done well and the choices he had made well had been real, had mattered, had been seen. He nodded to her. She nodded back. In the weeks and months that followed, things changed in ways that were neither dramatic nor sudden, but that accumulated steadily into something unmistakable. Daniel took on more work with the company, still on his own terms, still on a schedule that kept Emma at the center. He hired a good part-time assistant to help with the freelance side of his work, a young woman fresh out of technical school, who reminded him a little of himself at that age, too careful, too eager to prove herself, not yet sure that the careful part was already an asset. He spent time teaching her not just the technical skills, but the way of approaching a problem that he had developed over years. The patience, the willingness to go slowly when going slowly was right, the ability to resist the pressure of urgency when urgency was the wrong response. Victoria found, over that time, that the thing she had said in the speech was something she had been accumulating evidence for all year, without realizing she was building a case. She had meant it when she said it, meant every word, but it was only afterward, in the days following the gathering, in conversations that referenced it. In the particular way, her own posture shifted when she walked into a room where Daniel was already working, that she understood she had been building toward that statement for months. The folder was one piece of it. The security report was another. The way her junior engineers talked about him, not with awe exactly, but with the particular warmth of people who had been treated as intelligent and capable and worth investing in, people who had been given the experience of being trusted before they had fully trusted themselves, was another. The way Emma shook hands with the gravity of someone conducting official business, the way he talked about Rebecca without self-pity, with a directness that honored the reality of the loss without asking anyone to carry it with him, the way he sat in a difficult meeting and said the true thing plainly, without armor, without softening it to protect anyone's feelings, and somehow managed to do it in a way that did not feel harsh. She had come into her father's company carrying everything he had left her, his vision, his standards, his expectation that the world should be approached with rigor and integrity. And she had spent 2 years wondering whether those expectations were too high for the world, as it actually was. Daniel's presence was, in a quiet and consistent way, evidence that they were not. Not because he was perfect, not because he was exceptional in the way that stories often require people to be exceptional, but because he was simply who he was, all the way through, without calculation or performance. He was the same person in the conference room at 10 at night, alone with a drive full of data, and every opportunity to look, as he was in the speech room surrounded by his colleagues and his daughter and the lifted glasses of people who admired him. That consistency was the thing. That was what could not be manufactured or approximated or replaced by talent alone. On a Tuesday morning in late summer, Emma started 2nd grade. She had a new backpack that she had picked out herself, dark blue, with a small embroidered lightning bolt on the front pocket, which she had chosen because lightning was fast, she explained, and she intended to be fast at 2nd grade. Daniel walked her to school the long way, because the long way went past the park. And she liked the park in the morning when it was still quiet, when the dew was still on the grass, and the only people there were dog walkers and one old man who sat on the same bench every morning reading a newspaper. She held his hand at the crosswalk and told him, somewhere between the corner and the school gate, that she had decided she wanted to learn how computers worked, not just how to use them. Everyone knew how to use them, but how they actually worked inside, the real way. He asked what had made her think about that. She considered the question seriously, the way she always did, chewing her bottom lip, and then said she thought it was because she wanted to be able to fix things when they broke. She said it as though it were obvious. He thought about that for the rest of the walk. There is a kind of intelligence that announces itself, that wears its credentials like a badge and calibrates its behavior to what will be noticed and rewarded. It is the kind that knows exactly when to speak and exactly what to say, that reads the room and adjusts accordingly. And it can take a person very far. And there is another kind that simply operates, that does the right thing in the right way for no audience at all, that makes its choices based on what those choices actually are, rather than on what they will look like in the moment of making them. The second kind is quieter. It takes up less space. It does not always call attention to itself in the ways that get rewarded in ordinary professional life. But when you encounter it, when you are present for one of the moments when it reveals itself in a conference room late at night, in the rain, over a damaged drive, and a folder full of someone else's grief and memory and loss, it is unmistakable. It has a particular quality, a particular weight. The specific gravity of a thing that is real all the way through. Sometimes what changes a life is not the most impressive person in the room. It is the most honest one. It is the one who, with every opportunity to take more than they are owed, takes only what belongs to them and returns the rest with care. It is the one who, at the moment of the small and invisible decision that no one will ever know about and no one will ever check, does the right thing anyway, not because someone is watching, because that is simply who they are.